Saw you before you saw me. The road home always looked the same to her, quiet, narrow, swallowed by the kind of darkness that lived between forgotten towns. Amber Reeves had crossed this stretch more times than she could count. Every dip, every sudden bend was part of her muscle memory. But tonight, something felt different. The shadows leaned in closer. The silence felt heavier. Even the hum of her engine sounded like it was holding its breath. Her psychology book lay beside her, still warm from hours of cramming in a lonely study booth. She spent the evening drilling concepts for tomorrow's exam, turning human behavior into flashcards and neat definitions. At 23, with graduation finally within reach and a new relationship that still felt glossy and unfamiliar, she thought she had a handle on her life. Everything had its place. Everything made sense. Until tonight. Earlier, Brandon had walked her out of the library. He'd kissed her softly, told her to be careful driving home. His hands had lingered, just a second too long, resting on her shoulders like he was memorizing something. She'd read it as affection. Only later would she understand it differently, as though he'd been checking a detail, confirming a pattern. At 11:47 p.m., the world behind her exploded in white. A pair of high beams slammed into her rearview mirror, washing her car in light so intense she had to angle the mirror away. The glare didn't dissolve into the distance. It stayed tight on her bumper, too tight. A truck, big, dark, close enough that she could feel its presence pressing against the back of her car. Her heartbeat stuttered. Brandon had driven separately tonight. He was nowhere near this road. She'd see him tomorrow. She held onto that thought like it was a lifeline, something solid to keep her from unraveling. The truck's lights flicked off, then on, then off again, then on. A pattern, deliberate, urgent. Her fingers clenched around the wheel. She nudged her speed higher, 60, 65, almost 70. The truck mirrored her perfectly, refusing to fall back or pull ahead. The lights flashed again, stabbing through the dark like a warning she didn't understand. Her mind scrambled, her phone in her purse, on the floor too far to reach. She thought of the exam, of Brandon's smile that morning, of the stories she tried not to read, girls who vanished on quiet roads, found days later in places no one should ever end up. Then finally, a lifeline. The turn toward her apartment complex appeared out of the dark. She swerved into it, tires screaming as the truck barreled in right behind her. Her building was just ahead, third on the left, familiar, ordinary, safe. Or it was supposed to be. She slid into her parking spot, air shaking with the roar of the truck as it pulled in behind her, headlights flooding through her back window like she was sitting under a spotlight. She didn't wait. Her door flew open before her brain could tell her not to move. Pure instinct took over. Her keys were already in her fist. Her purse snagged on the seat, but she didn't stop to grab it. She stumbled out, breath breaking, voice cracking into raw, tangled screams aimed at the truck, at the shape climbing out of it. Words failed her. Only terror came out, pure animal fear, the kind that bypasses thought entirely. Please, please don't. Amber's voice cracked as she backed away, the words spilling out between shaking breaths. Leave me alone, please. The man coming toward her didn't speed up or raise his hands. He moved slowly, almost cautiously, like he didn't want to scare her more than she already was. He was big, broad shoulders, thick beard, flannel shirt, work boots caked with dust. In his right hand he held something heavy. A tire iron. Her stomach dropped. Oh God. Ma'am, he said softly, almost apologizing with his tone. Ma'am, please, I need you to listen to me. "Get back," she yelled, stumbling away from him. "Get away from me." He didn't flinch. His voice stayed calm. "There's someone in your car." The sentence hit her like a foreign language. It didn't connect, didn't compute. Her brain fumbled, trying to put meaning to sounds. "What?" she whispered. "In your back seat." He pointed with the tire iron toward her open door, toward the glow of the interior light. "Every time I flashed my lights, I saw him. He kept ducking down, but I saw him. I saw the knife." Amber turned slowly, like her bones had turned to ice. The back seat looked empty, completely empty. She could see all the way to the rear windshield. "There's no one there," she said, voice trembling. "He must have slipped out when you jumped out of the car," the man insisted. "I'm telling you, I saw him. We need to call the police." Doors around the parking lot opened. Light spilled into the night as her neighbors stepped outside. Mrs. Miller from 3B in her bathrobe. The students from 2A still holding their mugs. Old Mr. Whitfield leaning on his cane, haunted eyes sharpened by instinct and memory. The stranger, this man with the tire iron, was already dialing. His voice stayed steady as he spoke. "Yes, this is an emergency. I followed a young woman home because someone was hiding in her back seat. We're at Meadowbrook Apartments, Clays Mill Road." Amber stood frozen between her car and the man who'd followed her all the way here, surrounded by people who suddenly seemed both too close and too far. Her pulse thundered in her ears. Her body still shook with leftover terror. But the man on the phone, he sounded like someone trying to help. When she forced herself to look at her car again, to truly look, she noticed it. Her textbook wasn't on the seat anymore. It had been knocked onto the floor. She hadn't done that. There was a faint scent in the air, cigarette smoke. She hated smoke, never once allowed it in her car. And then the smallest detail, one that changed everything. A wet, muddy footprint behind her seat. Yesterday had been rainy, but she hadn't stepped anywhere muddy, hadn't tracked anything like that into the car. Someone else had been there. The truth settled on her shoulders like a weight. A familiar logic whispered its way into her thoughts, evidence, cause, effect. She'd always trusted the pieces that fit neatly together. A stranger hiding, a weapon glinting, a footprint, a shifted book. The story made sense. And that was exactly how lies worked. The most dangerous ones answered every question, so perfectly you stopped doubting them. The police arrived in 9 minutes. Blue lights washed over the building, painting the night in pools in color. Officer Riley carefully walked her through what happened while his partner, Officer Hayes, leaned into her car with a flashlight, checking every corner, every shadow. The man who had followed her home introduced himself. Dennis Paulson, construction worker, long shift, heading home the same way she was. He repeated the same account 3 times, never hesitating, never changing a detail. The shape rising from her back seat, the flash of metal, the knife glinting in the dark. Officer Riley snapped his notebook shut with a soft thud. "You're lucky he noticed," he murmured. "You're unbelievably lucky." They found the man 40 minutes later, walking along Route 4, headed back toward Lexington like he'd simply stepped out for air. His name was Leonard Gast, 47, a history of break-ins and assault, a folding knife in his pocket. He insisted he'd never touched a car that night, never seen Amber in his life. But the mud on his boots told the truth, the exact same pattern they'd photographed inside her back seat. When Brandon finally arrived at 1:30 a.m., she saw him before she heard him, sprinting across the lot, eyes wide, breath tight. as if he'd been running long before he reached the complex. The moment she told him everything, his expression cracked open. It wasn't shock, it wasn't confusion. It was the face of someone who realized how close he'd come to losing something he wasn't ready to lose. She clung to him, letting his arms wrap around her, letting the shaking in her body settle. But in the background, a tiny part of her captured details she wouldn't understand until much later. The way he paused for half a second before embracing her, like he was waiting to see what she would say first. The exact order of his questions: are you hurt? Did they catch him? Are you sure you're okay? Delivered with the precision of someone reciting a memorized script. The steady rhythm of his heartbeat against her cheek, not racing with fear or relief, but smooth, controlled, almost prepared. But she didn't notice any of that night. Not really. At 1:30 a.m., all she felt was safety returning in the shape of his arms. "I should have driven you home," he whispered into her hair. "I should have been there. You had no way of knowing. I should have been there." Dennis Paulson, her unexpected guardian on the dark stretch of highway, refused every bit of gratitude she tried to give him. No reward, no interview. He even refused the local reporter who came knocking at his trailer. When Brandon tracked him down to thank him personally, Dennis only clasped his hand and said, "Take care of your girl. There's a lot of bad folks out there. We look out for each other where we can." The story spread across campus faster than she expected. Students saved by quick-thinking passerby. Her psychology professor even mentioned it during lecture, talked about moral courage, about stepping forward when others might look away. People she barely recognized stopped her between classes to tell her they were glad she was safe. Brandon started picking her up every evening after that. It felt natural, protective. It felt like something someone who truly cared would do. And for a little while, it eased her nerves. Until the nightmares began. Not about knives, not about the man in her back seat, but about smaller, stranger things. Dreams where she was driving and couldn't remember her destination, where the road kept twisting into places she didn't recognize, where familiar faces melted into the dark. Dreams where she wasn't sure who was sitting behind her or who was sitting beside her. Amber's dreams had changed. They weren't nightmares about the attack itself. They were subtler, stranger. She'd wake up certain Brandon was in her apartment, standing silently in corners she hadn't unlocked. Sometimes she'd find herself wandering through unfamiliar rooms, keys in her pocket for doors she had never seen. One Thursday morning, she mentioned it over breakfast. Brandon was at the stove, cracking eggs one-handed with a precision that made her stomach both calm and tense. He started staying over almost every night, insisting he slept better knowing she was safe. "The dreams are normal," he said, not looking back. "Your brain is working through what happened. It's trying to make sense of it." "What do they feel like?" she asked, frowning. She didn't know how to explain it, just that they carried the feeling of a warning she couldn't quite grasp, a sense that something was hidden in plain sight. She shrugged. "Weird," she said finally. He brought her plate over, kissed her head gently. "Time fixes it," he whispered. "Time." And she wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust that everything would settle. Brandon made sure she did. But she didn't know the full story yet. Brandon Collier hadn't just started dating Amber after that night. He'd been studying her carefully for months before the drive home on Route 421. Not as a boyfriend, yet not in love, but with the methodical patience of someone tracking a specimen. He memorized her routines, the way she drove alone, the exact roads she preferred. He knew her apartment, her locks, even the small ways she sometimes left her window open. He cataloged her kindness, her trusting nature, her instinct to apologize even when she wasn't at fault. He knew she was perfect for his plan. The story, the legend, was older than him, older than her. A warning whispered through dorm rooms, told over late-night conversations, etched into cautionary tales parents passed down. The stranger in the back seat, the blinding high beams, the lone rescuer who showed up just in time. Dennis, the man who saved her, had called it the oldest play in the book, when Brandon was just 17, learning the ropes of the family business. People believe what makes sense, Dennis had explained. They'll accept a random act of violence easier than the truth that someone planned it just for them, and they'll trust completely the one who steps in to save them. Amber had believed in the safety Brandon offered that night, never imagining the careful observation, the patient study, the way the pieces had all been measured long before the danger arrived. What felt like rescue had been part of a story written long ago, and she was the unwitting protagonist. Dennis wasn't really Dennis, and he wasn't exactly a construction worker either, though he could frame a house if he needed to. He was Brandon's uncle, a man who had spent 3 decades perfecting the craft of manipulation, turning it into something precise, almost elegant. Leonard Gast wasn't a drifter either. He was Dennis's partner, currently sitting in county lockup, waiting for a bail that would be quietly handled by a lawyer who specialized in making inconvenient problems vanish. The knife in his pocket had never been used, and forensic tests would reveal nothing. His story about hitchhiking was full of holes, but none of that mattered. He was the monster in the tale. That was his role. Brandon's role was the hero, the devoted boyfriend who understood exactly what Amber had endured, who could make her feel safe again. The trap wasn't physical, it was psychological. You didn't abduct someone off the street. That left witnesses, evidence, exposure. No, you made them come to you. You made them need you. Phase 1, the rescue. Phase 2, the bonding. After that night, Brandon drove Amber home every single evening, walked her to her door, checked her apartment before she went inside. She'd given him a key after the first week, insisting on it, claiming it would help her feel safer knowing he could get in if something went wrong. He accepted with just the right mix of reluctance, of concern, of, "Are you sure about this?" He brewed her coffee before her 8 a.m. class, texted between his own lectures to check on her, held her when nightmares tore her from sleep, was patient with her fear, understanding with her startle reflex, supportive when she began missing classes, consumed by what if she couldn't shake. "You need to talk to someone," he said, 15 days after the incident, calm and deliberate. "A professional. This is PTSD, Amber. It's real, and it's not going to heal on its own." She cried when he said it, not out of frustration, not out of shame, but because he understood, because he didn't tell her to get over it or to be grateful she survived. He had done his homework, researched therapists covered by the university plan, prepared a list of names, even offered to go with her to the first appointment. Dr. Susan Powell wasn't on that list. She wasn't covered by the university health plan, but she was renowned for her work. What she specialized in was subtle, insidious reinforcement of dependency. "The trauma you experienced was profound," Dr. Powell told Amber in their 3rd session. "It's normal to feel safest with the people who were present, who truly understand what you went through. Brandon's support is vital to your recovery." Dr. Powell had been practicing for 20 years, never lost her license, always paid her taxes on time, donated generously to charity. Every detail painted a picture of competence, of trustworthiness, of authority, everything Amber could latch onto. And Brandon, always there, steady, unwavering, was part of the architecture that made her rely on him completely. Amber had begun to notice patterns she didn't want to see. Some therapists, she learned, were referred by people who understood exactly what kind of patient would benefit from or be vulnerable to their methods. Brandon had found Dr. Powell through Dennis, who had found her through someone else, a chain of recommendations hidden behind the facade of care. Networks within networks, a support system for predators who wore the mask of helpers. Phase 3, Brandon knew, was isolation, but it had to feel like love. Slowly, Amber's world shrank. Thursday night dinners with her study group became too overwhelming. The thought of walking anywhere after dark filled her with anxiety, even surrounded by friends. Calls from her former roommate, Kayla, went unanswered. Kayla had moved to Louisville, and explaining what she felt, what only Brandon seemed to understand, was impossible over the phone. Her parents checked in every Sunday. Their voices, filled with concern, felt heavy, suffocating, their questions subtle accusations. "Are you really okay?" Over and over they made her feel fragile, broken. Brandon never did that. He made her feel safe, protected, in control. By April, they had been dating 4 months. By May, Amber was failing classes and on academic probation. By June, she had moved in with him. The apartment was 20 minutes from campus in Nisholasville, beyond the reach of buses, too far to walk every day. Brandon had a car. Brandon could drive her anywhere. Brandon worked from home most days, handling logistics, contracts, supply chain work. Always there, always watching, always available. The apartment's locks were sturdy. Security mattered to Brandon, everything in its place. And yet, Amber didn't notice, didn't fully see the architecture of control he had built around her until September, 6 months after that night on Route 421. It happened while she was cleaning. Brandon had gone to the gym, his regular routine, Tuesdays and Thursdays, 2:00 to 4:00 p.m., a ritual for decompressing. Amber had learned not to offer to go with him. Everyone needs space, she told herself. She respected it. The vacuum caught on the corner of the bottom drawer of his office filing cabinet. The drawer wasn't fully closed. Maybe the lock was faulty. Maybe it was nothing. She told herself not to look. Inside were folders, neat, labeled, perfectly organized with the same precision Brandon applied to everything. She told herself it was probably boring work, contracts, invoices. She told herself a lot of things in the 3 minutes she hovered there, staring at the files, the realization creeping closer even as she tried to convince herself it was nothing. Amber stood frozen, the air around her suddenly heavy, as though the room itself knew what she was about to discover. The first folder lay in her hands, and the moment she saw the name printed across the tab, her stomach dropped. Her own name. Amber Reeves, University of Kentucky. She flipped it open with trembling fingers. Inside were images of herself. Amber walking to her car after a late study session. Amber sipping coffee by the window of the campus cafe. Amber unlocking the door to her apartment building. Dozens of photos, all printed, all carefully dated. And the dates began long before she ever knew Brandon existed. Back in December, 3 months before the psychology department's spring mixer. She remembered that night all too well. February 14th, Valentine's Day. Brandon had laughed and said it must be destiny that they crossed paths on the most romantic night of the year. She'd blushed then, thinking it was sweet. Now that memory felt like a trick, a setup. He hadn't stumbled into her life by chance. He had positioned himself there. He had studied her patterns, learned her schedule, and waited for the moment she'd be easiest to approach. The picture on top was dated December 3rd. Amber in her blue winter coat. Amber holding the same psychology textbook that later sat on her passenger seat the night everything changed. She remembered that week vividly. Finals coming up, stress piling high, long evenings spent alone. Perfect moments for someone like him to watch her unnoticed. Her pulse thundered as she reached for the second folder. This one held a different name. L. Brennan, University of Louisville. A young woman's face stared up at her from a photocopied ID. Louise Brennan, 22. Brunette. Soft smile. The kind of person who looked like she had everything going for her. But the photos inside told a different story. Louise caught on camera at random moments, unaware she wasn't alone. And beneath those images were newspaper cutouts. Louisville student missing, March 2023. Family begs for answers. Police continue search. Amber's breath hitched. She sank to the floor, folder after folder slipping from her hands as she realized there were more, 9 in total. 9 women, 9 lives. Every folder held pictures. 7 included headlines about vanished students. 2 had death certificates. Her eyes burned, but she forced herself to keep going. She owed them that. Every face, every detail, every trace of who they were. She made herself memorize it all. Someone needed to remember them. Someone who understood exactly what had been done. Louise's story came together piece by piece. A nursing student who had suddenly started missing classes, isolating from friends. Her boyfriend, a man named Michael Miller, had told investigators she'd become terrified of being watched. No one had listened. The police labeled it emotional distress. And when she disappeared, they assumed she'd left on her own or harmed herself. 6 months later, her body was found in Daniel, Boone National Forest. That was where they found Louise. And suddenly, the pattern snapped into place like a trap, closing around her ankles. Every folder told the same quiet, horrifying story. A woman watched from a distance. A sudden perfect boyfriend. Friends drifting away. Daily life shrinking until it was just him. Then silence. Sometimes a body, sometimes nothing at all. Amber shut the final folder with careful, deliberate movements, aligning the corners exactly as they'd been. The vacuum still roared pointlessly in the background. She'd forgotten she'd even turned it on. She switched it off, coiled the cord, tucked it into the closet. Her hands operated on autopilot while her mind clung to the only thing that mattered. These women were gone. She was. Not yet. She was standing in the home of a man she trusted, a man she had cried to, slept beside, leaned on, a man who held her shaking body and whispered that she was safe, a man who had been photographing her long before their first conversation. Once the thought formed, everything aligned in a cold, mathematical way. If he'd tracked her months before they met, he knew her path that night. He knew where she parked. He knew where she'd be when the truck stopped behind her. He knew she'd be vulnerable enough to need a hero. Her legs carried her to the bathroom before she understood what she was doing. She fell to her knees and heaved until her stomach was empty and raw. The sound echoed through the apartment, sharp and ugly. When it was over, she cleaned the floor, rinsed her mouth, and stared at her reflection. Pale, yes. Shaking, yes. But not hysterical. She needed to look normal. Normal was survival. At exactly 4:15, the front door clicked. Right on schedule. Brandon's key slid into the lock, and her entire body reacted with that familiar conditioned exhale, like a pet hearing its owner's footsteps. The relief wasn't real, it was learned. "Hey babe," he said, leaning in to kiss her forehead. He smelled like sweat and industrial soap from the gym. "How was your day?" "Fine," she said. "I cleaned." "You didn't have to." "I wanted to." He smiled, the same smile she'd adored for months, but now she saw the truth hidden inside its perfection. Not absence of emotion, but precision of it. Every crinkle near his eyes, every soft pull of his mouth, every note of affection was perfectly calibrated. Too perfect. Last semester she had taken a seminar on micro-expressions. Real emotion was messy. It leaked out unevenly, came late, shifted too quickly. The professor had taught them that liars overcompensated, made their faces symmetrical, timed their smiles like rehearsed cues. Brandon's face was a masterclass in control. That was the problem. No honest feeling ever looked that clean. "I'm gonna hop in the shower," he said lightly. "Then we can put something on. You've been a little tense lately." "That sounds nice," she replied. She watched him walk down the hall, watched him close the bathroom door, listened for the water turning on. Then she turned her eyes toward the apartment entrance. The locks were sturdy. Brandon always said they needed to be. To protect them. To keep danger out. But they also kept her in. She had no car. No house key of her own. And no one who still called enough to question her silence. Just the sound of running water. And the knowledge that she had minutes, maybe seconds, to decide whether she'd end up as the next folder in that cabinet. She had no job, no income, no independence left to stand on. She'd given up her campus work-study position in July because the idea of being around people felt unbearable. Brandon had insisted it was fine. He'd take care of her until she graduated. Her phone was on his plan. Her rent was covered by him. Her groceries, her rides, her everything flowed quietly through his wallet. And her parents, they adored him from a distance. Thought their daughter had finally found someone dependable. Thought her withdrawal was trauma healing, not a warning sign. The women in the folders were gone. But she wasn't gone. Not yet. That tiny truth throbbed inside her like a pulse of light in a sealed room. She wasn't in the final stage. She was still inside the part of the script where she was meant to stay. The stage before the vanishing, before the forest, before the files became history. She'd studied psychology for years. She'd written essays on trauma responses, done presentations on learned helplessness, memorized lectures on attachment patterns. Knowing theory was one thing. Living it was something else entirely. The shower shut off. Water dripped. Tiles clicked under his feet as he moved around, humming with the relaxed confidence of someone who believes his world is perfectly arranged. Why wouldn't he be happy? Everything was unfolding exactly the way he designed it. The realization didn't arrive as a scream. It settled like a heavy, undeniable truth. She was not living her own life. She was living inside someone else's plan. Every choice she thought she'd made had been planted, nudged, encouraged. The therapist, the isolation, the dependency, the slow shrinking of her world until the only safe place left was the one he controlled. Fear wasn't an accident. Fear was the foundation. She walked into the kitchen, filled a glass of water her throat could never swallow, and stared at the front door. Those reinforced locks, he'd installed them the day she moved in. For safety, he'd said. But she remembered the locksmith's offhand remark. Deadbolts that lock from both sides, technically illegal. Brandon had slipped him extra cash. The locksmith had shrugged and installed them anyway. Back then she thought it was sweet. Brandon always planning ahead, always making sure she was protected. But the water in her glass trembled. Her hand trembled. She didn't need a textbook to tell her the truth. Brandon already knew she opened the folders. He knew it before she ever spoke a word because she, quiet, dutiful, conditioned Amber, had changed. Not in dramatic ways, in small ones. She had kept a little more space between them on the couch. Her laugh during the movie had landed a beat too late. Her eyes had flicked toward the hallway more often than usual. These things were microscopic. But Brandon had been studying people since he was 15. He knew the instant someone's fear changed shape. And now she understood something even colder. The drawer hadn't been left open by accident. That too was part of the sequence. Phase 4. The unveiling. The moment the victim finally recognized the cage and realized the door had already clicked shut. She wasn't the first person to sit at that table, staring across at him, trying to look calm while her pulse hammered like a trapped bird in her throat. Most people broke right here. This was the point where hope snapped. This was the point where they realized the story they thought they were living wasn't theirs at all. Some tried to bolt. Those were the ones whose faces ended up beside cause of death forms. Some pretended to accept it, pretending to fold while secretly searching for cracks in the walls. Those ones. He enjoyed those the most. Amber, in his mind, leaned toward the latter. Smart, resourceful, that rare kind who didn't crumble instantly. He liked that. Intelligence had a way of making the unraveling more elegant, and the buyers appreciated women whose minds had once shone brightly. He gave her 3 days. 3 whole days to stew in the truth, to think she was being stealthy, to imagine she still had options. On the evening of the 3rd day, while she plated dinner, perfectly seasoned chicken, sautéed vegetables, a scene as peaceful as any picture in a home magazine, he finally spoke. You saw the files. Her fingers went rigid. The fork hung in midair. For a breath, her face cracked open in pure, animal panic. Then the mask slid back on. Her voice evened out. I don't know what you're talking about. He chuckled quietly. Amber, you know. A stillness settled between them. He watched her eyes. He didn't need her words. The tiny muscles around her mouth gave her away. She was calculating, thousands of thoughts sprinting behind her expression. So she asked, who were they? He tilted his head. Does it matter? Were they real? Louise, the others, were they actually real people? As real as you. He saw the moment the puzzle clicked together for her. The doors that needed keys from both sides, the windows sealed like a vault, the roots he'd isolated her from, the subtle erasing of her connections. He saw her realize every escape she'd ever imagined had already been accounted for. This was the part he loved. The slow, dawning realization that she'd never been in control of anything. What happens now? She asked, steady as stone. Now he picked up his glass. Now you choose. She didn't move. Didn't blink. "You can try to walk out," he said, "but no one will side with you. I'm the man who protected you. I'm the one who helped you after the attack. Your parents adore me. Your friends don't call because you shut them out. Everything looks clean. Every trail leads exactly where I want it to." He set the glass down with a soft click. "Or," he continued, "you stay. You accept the life already built around you. Then everything stays calm." "And if I do?" she asked quietly. A smile crept onto his face. "You'll learn what happens when you make me teach you." She looked around at the domestic little world she'd unknowingly arranged for him. The dinner she'd cooked, the wine she'd poured, the apartment she kept tidy. It all looked so normal, so safe. A dollhouse that doubled as a cage. "I need time," she whispered, "to think." "Of course," he said warmly. "Take all the time you want." He took another bite of his meal before adding, almost casually, "Oh, one more thing. I changed the passwords to your email and socials earlier. Too many cyber threats lately. Can't be too careful." Her blood iced. Every illusion of autonomy dissolved. In that moment, she understood a truth so sharp it cut straight through her. She wasn't meant to survive this place. Maybe not today. Maybe not even this year. But whenever she stopped being compliant, whenever her usefulness dimmed, he'd do to her what had been done to the faces inside those folders. And unless she found a way to shatter the script he'd written for her, she'd seen the pattern long before she became part of it. Women reduced to files, to digital ghosts tucked away in a folder he thought she'd never find. They weren't memories, they were warnings, and she understood with a cold clarity that she was simply the latest in a long line, replaceable the moment he got restless. Most people in her position made one fatal mistake. They ran too soon. He'd even explained the trap to her once, smiling as if he were proud of its craftsmanship. The doors, the routines, the way he shaped her days, everything was designed to push her toward frantic, useless attempts at escape. He wanted her desperate. He wanted her wild. That was part of the thrill for him. But she refused to give him that show. For 2 careful weeks, she slipped into a role so convincing it almost convinced her. She let her tears come when he expected them. She ate just enough to appear fragile, letting her body look like it was shrinking under the weight of fear. She pulled away from the bedroom, choosing the couch instead, pretending she couldn't bear being close to him at night. She let her hands tremble when he brushed past her. It was all performance, layered, deliberate, and painfully real. And he bought it. Of course he did. He'd seen fear before, but never the kind that carried a quiet mind behind it. The worst moments weren't the ones where she was scared. Fear was easy. Fear was simple. What tested her was his casual kindness, a hand on her shoulder, a soft goodnight hug. In those moments, every nerve screamed to pull away, to let him see the fury replacing her terror. But she couldn't. She had to stand still while his breath brushed her neck and her mind ran calculations. The number of steps to the fire escape, how long the drop was, the best route to the nearest bus stop, the hours until he'd be at work again. Every laugh she faked, every nod she gave, had a second layer beneath it. Her tracking which password had a symbol which had numbers, which patterns might unlock the laptop he thought was invisible to her. Each second she appeared small, she was actually razor-focused, mapping exits, schedules, and weaknesses. The tension lived inside her body. Her jaw locked so often it throbbed. Her shoulders stayed curled with silent strain, even while she slept. But the pain kept her awake, kept her from slipping too far into the character she was pretending to be. What he didn't notice was how she watched him. how she counted the days he left early for the gym, Tuesday and Thursday, how she marked the Monday meetings he assumed she never heard him talk about. Those meetings always kept him away for at least 3 hours, long enough. What he didn't notice was her discovery of the spare car key he hid inside a tiny magnetic box beneath the drawer, or the slow disappearance of small bills from his wallet, $10 here, $20 there, never enough to spark suspicion, but slowly forming a lifeline. Piece by piece, she was building the one thing he never expected her to have. A way out. For 7 quiet days, she slipped bills from his wallet in tiny increments, $5 at a time. A number small enough to stay invisible, but steady enough to build the start of a lifeline. And while he slept, she worked. At 2 in the morning, when his snores filled the apartment like a heavy engine, she crept into the master bathroom. The window there had been sealed with layers of old paint, but not locked. All she needed was a butter knife and patience. It took 4 nights of slow, careful pressure to loosen it without a sound. On the second night, the knife slipped. The metal tore into her palm, sending a warm rush of blood down her wrist. She clamped a towel over it, swallowing the scream that burned in her throat. By the time the bleeding stopped, she was shaking. She buried the towel deep beneath the laundry she knew he never touched, the clothes he dismissed as hers, the ones he found embarrassing, the ones he never bothered to look at. The cut eventually healed into a thin, pale scar, a small white mark that strangers would forever misunderstand. Behind that window was a narrow ledge that linked directly to the fire escape. A fire escape that shouldn't have been blocked, shouldn't have been neglected, shouldn't have been forgotten. But like everything else about this place, it was a quiet violation no one cared enough to fix. On the third night at 3 a.m., she climbed out barefoot. The metal was cold enough to sting. Each step tested the bolts, the railings, the rust. She stood there for 5 entire minutes, chest rising and falling in the crisp autumn air, realizing how long it had been since she felt alive. Then she climbed back inside, slid beneath the covers, and lay beside the man who believed she was broken. But she wasn't broken, she was waiting. On the third Monday, the one she knew he'd be gone for at least 3 hours, she listened to the front door close, gave it 20 minutes, then slipped out through the bathroom window for the last time. The fire escape groaned faintly but held. The alley below was empty. The parking lot beyond was nearly deserted. His car was gone. She walked toward the bus stop in the same clothes she'd slept in. Thin shirt, worn sweats, bare arms stinging from the cold. She had no phone, no bag, no plan beyond getaway. The only things in her pockets were the $50 she'd collected and the spare key, which she tossed into a storm drain 3 blocks from the apartment, burying it under rainwater and rust forever. The bus carried her into downtown Lexington. From there, she walked straight to the police station, pushed open the door, and approached the front desk. The officer on duty looked up with the mild irritation of someone expecting a routine complaint. When he saw her chilled to the bone, hair messy, eyes wild with sleeplessness, his expression shifted. He began silently sorting her into the wrong categories: runaway, addict, unstable. But she didn't waver. "My name is Amber Reeves," she said, steady and clear. "I need to report a kidnapping." He blinked, confused. "Ma'am, are you hurt? Do you need medical help?" "I need to report a kidnapping," she repeated, slower, firmer. "My boyfriend is involved in human trafficking. I have information about multiple murders. I need to speak to a detective." The moment she said those last 2 words, multiple murders, Everything in the room changed. They didn't hesitate after those words left her mouth. The officer's hand went straight for his radio. Within minutes, she was escorted down a quiet hallway and into a small conference room that smelled faintly of old carpet and burnt coffee. They wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. Someone handed her a paper cup of water with both hands, like she might drop it. "Start wherever you can," they said. So she did. She told them everything, the folders, the faces, the missing women whose stories were trapped in Brandon's apartment. She gave them the address. She told them how long he'd been gone. She begged them to hurry, to get there before he realized she'd vanished, before he torched the files, before he cleaned away the truth. Detective Carver was the one who listened. A man in his 50s with calm eyes and the kind of patience people develop after decades of hearing the worst things humans can do. He asked questions that proved he was paying attention. Details, timelines, things she hadn't realized she remembered. When she finally stopped talking, he nodded once, stood, and walked out. An hour passed. When he returned, a woman in a dark suit walked in behind him. Confident posture, steady gaze. "Miss Reeves," he said gently, "this is Agent Holland." The woman set a tablet on the table and opened it without a word. The screen filled with photographs, the kind taken at scenes no one walks away from. Amber's stomach turned. These weren't missing person posters. These were bodies. Agent Holland spoke with a slow, steady certainty. "We've been tracking a trafficking organization operating through Kentucky and Tennessee for 3 years, she said. "We believe your boyfriend is part of that system, and we do not believe the incident on Route 421 was an accident." Amber's breath caught. Something inside her unclenched, a small, shaky release she hadn't felt in months. They believed her. They were already onto him. "The man who rescued you that night," Holland continued, "Dennis Paulson, we've been monitoring him for a long time. Different names, different plates, same pattern." "And the other man," she added, flipping to a photo of the stranger from the back seat. Leonard gasped. "We arrested him that night. He was released on bail and vanished 2 weeks later." Amber felt the room tilt. "They're connected," Holland said softly. "We've suspected it for months, but they're skilled. They cover their steps. They use new identities. They erase everything." Amber swallowed. The folders, the photos, the apartment. "Gone," Holland said, not unkindly. "They have protocols. Someone was likely sent the moment you walked out the door. By now there won't be a single thing left that ties him to anything." "And Brandon," Amber asked quietly, "what happens to him?" "He'll have a story prepared," Holland said. "A convincing one. You were traumatized. You were struggling emotionally. He was trying to help. Your therapist will back him without even realizing they're part of the chain." A coldness spread through Amber's chest. "Dr. Powell," she whispered. "We've been watching him too," Holland replied. "We suspect involvement, but suspicion and proof aren't the same." Detective Carver leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "Right now, the most important thing is keeping you safe." Amber stared at the tablet, at the women who had trusted the wrong moment, the wrong stranger, the wrong promise. Women who never got to walk into a police station. Women whose names were now evidence tags. "What do I do now?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Carver didn't hesitate. "You go home," he said, "to your parents in Ohio. You switch schools. You change your name if you want. You disappear on purpose, with documents, with records, with a trail that we can protect." Agent Holland nodded. "You survive," she said quietly, "the right way." They told her the part no victim ever wants to hear. "You stay quiet, you stay safe, and you let us do our job." It felt like swallowing broken glass. "So he just walks?" she asked. "For now," Agent Holland replied softly. "But you're alive, and what you gave us today is more than we had when we woke up this morning." They didn't sugarcoat it. They didn't promise justice wrapped in a pretty bow. They simply walked her outside, handed her a bus ticket, slipped her a card with a number that didn't show up in directories, and instructed her to call it if anything felt wrong. At the bus station, she called her parents. Her mother sobbed before Amber could finish the first sentence. Her father, steady as ever, said only, "We'll be there." When the bus pulled away at 2:15 p.m., she watched the city shrink behind her, the streets where she had once felt safe, the apartment where she had learned what real fear tasted like, the state line she swore she'd never cross again. The farther the bus rumbled, the more her heart beat steady. But her mind didn't rest. She pictured him opening the front door, seeing the empty couch, seeing the bathroom window, understanding immediately. She didn't know if he'd rage or smirk. Both were terrifying. And she thought of the women in those folders, the ones whose stories ended quietly, buried in fields and forests, the ones who would never board a bus home. Her parents were waiting at the station in Columbus. They didn't ask for details. Not yet. They just drove her home, back to the bedroom with old posters, old memories, and a kind of safety she hadn't felt in a long time. Over the next 3 days, the dam finally broke. She told them everything. Every secret. Every night she'd feared she wouldn't wake up. Every detail of how she'd escaped. They wanted to storm the police station, file reports, get him arrested themselves. But when she told them about Agent Holland, about the investigation that stretched across multiple states, about the danger of going public, they listened. They trusted her. They always had. Then they helped her rebuild. They helped her transfer to Ohio State. Helped her change her name to Amber Brennan, honoring the girl in the folder who didn't get a chance to live her own future. Someone had to carry that name forward. They paid for a small apartment in Columbus, a security system, and a therapist whose loyalty belonged to no one except her. And Amber lived. She graduated. She started working at a domestic violence nonprofit guiding women who believed escape was impossible. She understood them, the mental cages, the invisible chains, the way someone could convince you that captivity was safety. She was good at the work because she had lived it. She never heard from Brandon Collier again. But sometimes, crossing a street or riding the bus, she'd catch a glimpse of a stranger who smiled the wrong kind of smile, and her chest would tighten. Because even though he never reached out, she always had a feeling. He was still out there, still moving, still hunting, and still remembering the one woman who slipped through his fingers. She learned to live in the in-between, somewhere between survival and fear, between moving forward and constantly checking over her shoulder. It wasn't the kind of dread that kept you frozen. It was the quieter kind, the one that whispered at the edges of normal life, reminding her that some doors never fully close. Every time a news anchor mentioned another missing woman, she felt that old coldness slip down her spine. When a case went quiet, she wondered if his name was hidden somewhere in the margins. She could almost see his smile in the statistics that kept climbing, the ones people skimmed past without realizing they were reading a map of someone's nightmare. 2 years after her escape, Detective Carver called her. His voice carried an exhaustion she recognized too well. "We've lost the trail," he admitted. "They changed their methods, went deeper." He apologized, as if any of this failure belonged to him, as if the blame didn't sit on the shoulders of men who had perfected the art of vanishing in plain sight. Sometimes she wondered if there was a file in some hidden cabinet with her new name on it, her new address, her new life. She would check the locks 3 times before bed, fingers trembling harder on the 3rd pass. She'd search for self-defense classes, hovering over the sign-up button without pressing it. But through all of that, she lived. She refused to let the shadow of one man consume more of her future. The nightmare stayed. Not the ones with headlights and backseat strangers. Those would have been simple, straightforward. Monsters in those stories wore their masks openly. Her nightmares were quieter. They were about the night she sat across from a man she trusted and finally understood the truth behind the way he watched her. About realizing that manipulation can sound like affection and cages can look like love. About all the women who were still laughing at dinners, still sharing beds, still believing they were safe, while living beside the person they should fear most. Epilogue. Far away in the dim light of a different apartment, Brandon Collier slid a drawer shut with a practiced hand. The folders were already gone, loaded into Dennis's truck, on their way to be buried in another state, erased if necessary. He moved efficiently, calmly, like someone finishing a project rather than dismantling a crime scene. By morning, the apartment would be empty except for the lie he prepared. His girlfriend had suffered a breakdown and he'd had to move out quickly. People would nod sympathetically. They always did. He had built a career on being believed. Amber had outmaneuvered him longer than most. Clever, patient, unexpected. But she'd still made the fatal miscalculation. She thought freedom meant distance. He smiled at the thought. Freedom wasn't measured in miles. It was measured in fear. And she'd carry that fear for the rest of her life, second-guessing strangers, watching her reflections in windows, flinching at memories that refused to fade. She'd tell her story to anyone willing to listen, and nothing would come of it. The network was too refined, the system too slow. He was too good at disappearing. Fear was a prison, and he knew she would never stop feeling its walls. He loaded the last box into his car and paused in the doorway, admiring the neatness of it all. A solid run, months of work. The next one would be even smoother. He prided himself on evolution, constant refinement, constant improvement. His phone buzzed. A message from Dennis. New prospect, University of Tennessee, fits the criteria. A satisfied grin tugged at Brandon's lips. The game moved on. The stage changed, but the script stayed the same. The world was full of people desperate to believe in saviors. Men who arrived in the right moment with the right smile, offering the right kind of help. They never questioned whether the hand that rescued them was the same one tightening the noose. As he drove south, the sun dipped low behind him, casting long shadows across the road. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. Hundreds of miles away, in a small apartment in Columbus, Amber Brennan locked her door, then checked it again, and again. The evening news droned in the background, the anchors discussing weather and traffic and missing girls. She tried, just for a moment, not to think about the glare of headlights in a rearview mirror, not to think about who might be behind them. The monster was never the one hiding in the back seat. It was the one who taught you to run.